Good evening and welcome to the lecture 667. We are recording here in Hisingen, a little bit west of Gothenburg, the fourth island size-wise in Sweden. Of course after Gotland, Öland or Röstköl. Well, that would make it the fifth largest. How does that come about? Well, it's quantum physics we're talking about today, and anything can happen in quantum physics. We are today going to talk about Western dogma, but I mean that in a very broad sense. This is not dogma how we usually perceive it. Dogma is usually something we think is outspoken or verbalizable or written down or an agreement of some sort. This dogma is nothing of the kind. It was actually not formulated for the first 300-400 years it existed. And it's definitely more sturdy, more real than any written or spoken hypothesis. Its power is immense. But it also have completely different aspects. And they do not seem to get together, have anything to do with each other. And that is something you have to get used to in these lectures that are coming, a few of the ones that already been. One thing that actually come into the equation is will, human will. It's oddly enough something very important when it comes to quantum physics and the dogma. Because the dogma takes away the will, and therefore we think we have to add it. But will was never gone. That is very important to remember. Will cannot be taken out of the picture. And this has to do with the status of the dogma in contrast to the real world. And I formulated the dogma. It's a cumbersome formulation, but it's object in space in front of a subject. It doesn't make much sense, I agree, but remember, this was not verbalized for the first 300 centuries. It came to be verbalized much later. And when we start thinking about object in space in front of a subject, it had been going on for at least 400 years, I'd say, at least. In this penultimate lecture, I was speaking about, let's see here, thoughts. And one thing that is very common in the Western world is to say that the will produces thoughts. Conscious mind can make thoughts. I could say that quantum physics proven that to be completely wrong, because thoughts makes the superposition collapse. And for there to be an effect in quantum physics, the things affecting need to be material. It has to be something material, because only material things. How we define material, somebody might object. Well, I'll go for that so far. Let's see about that later. But what we define as material, that's okay for the moment. It needs to be something material, just in the same way that this needs to be material to make a sound when it hits the mug. And point proven. And most of the quantum physicists agreed on this. But it was mostly in mathematical terms, because you do quantum physics practically. It's a practice, you need to do it. And I mentioned before the words implicit and explicit are helping tools, but they will not be helping tools if you only stand and ask what do they mean. They need to be practiced actively. And Bohm is very precise by pointing that out. They would be completely dead as the Western dogma, if they are only translated. They need to be practiced in daily talk, in daily thinking. and they need to sit in the memory spot really hard. Memory takes a really important part. No problems. Memory takes a really important part here as well, because if we're not able to remember those things and practice those things. I've been talking with my dear colleague before here about rote learning and how that disappeared. Rote learning is important, and when you study technical subject you need to do rote learning, and you need to know that you need to repeat within 24 hours, a third time within 3 days, and a fourth time within a week. You won't sit, we know that for a fact. And when you make the things like practice things, I would say they almost become material. And that's what a material thought is. When you train every day, you do this specific training, you change your materiality. And there's this materiality that also stands for the understanding in the end. So that's the reason why you need to practice. And I'd say in the Western dogma, they don't practice, and one of the reasons is they think we can learn by translating in our head. New subjects, we just translate them to what we already have. And then we ask the question why, how, and what, and where. And by using those questions, we think we can translate. But that is not the case here. It's no translation, it's not what, why, where. It is about learning a new thing. And how do you learn in quantum physics? You practice. There's no other way of learning. So this is part of the dogma actually. It's this passivity. Then you think you have a private language and all the thing to learn something in a book. All I have to do is translate that to my private language. I laugh now, it's very silly. But that's what we think. And this is a habit that's really hard to hack, but you need to put an effort. You need to be able to remember, otherwise you will never learn quantum physics. They will be stopped. That alley is stopped in that case. So you see here, I already mentioned 2 different areas that you thought had nothing to do with quantum physics. And that's why the dogma comes with so many surprises. All areas get in, but there's areas we don't even think of in ordinary mind. And for a quantum physicist, this comes from mathematics. It's a constant repetition of the figures, of the equations. They know them by heart. They have this training method. They repeat within 24 hours, within 3 days, with a week. It sounds trivial, but they all do that without any exception whatsoever, because that's the absolute minimum you need to understand this, and we need to do this as well. And there is a myth connected to this, and I really like. No, it's okay. I'm going to read it. So no, you can sit still. I'm going to read it. I took just a paraphrase from Lord of the Ring. There's one ring to rule them all, and this is the power of the dogma. It's also an illusion that we don't want to quit, because it's so enticing. It's something we really want. And that want we need to give up, because there's a lot of hard work instead of this power from the ring. And I would equate the power from the ring with the subject that is in the origo, the subject who does the understanding, and of course the subject who's the observer in the theater. That's the theory. A new term of seeing that came after the Iliad and the Odyssey, and this is completely passive. So you hear, there is a connection. If I want to translate to something I already know, it's an act of passivity. It's already static in my body or in my head somewhere, the private language, the representation. It's passivity. And then I don't have to do anything. And I heard one complaint about root learning. And he said that it's going to make you silly. I don't know what he was meaning. But is this lure? Is this enticement with the dogma? It's fascinating. Isn't it fascinating? You just read the book and you translate it in your head, and that is called learning. It's something magical with the whole thing, isn't it? It's creativity without you having to do anything. That's one of the illusions you need to knock down. It's not true. It's not at all true. But this goes to show why root learning has been so heavily criticized. This illusion that took hold of us, and we just want to perceive, have the ring that rules all of them. I'm not sure that J.R.R. Tolkien thought about quantum physics, or I mean the Western dogma in this case. I thought it was a good metaphor. But the second thing I also take from Lord of the Rings is that Sauron oversees everything. And it's this big eye in the sky who sees everything. And I'm 100% sure in this case he took it from the Western dogma. Of course, it's the subject, it's the oracle. It's the panopticon who sees everything, omniscient. Or it's the subject that we don't mention, that doesn't exist. I would call this lazy thinking. Thinking where you don't have to do anything. And it could have been created or made stronger by people who already had the ability to think hard and strong. People like Newton, for instance, and also Voltaire were, in a way, very, really good thinkers. Especially Newton was incredible. So he already had that power. He trained it for all his life. You train this stuff. This is something you train over and over again. And then you become stronger at it. And that strength is needed to understand these things. It doesn't come easily, because learning is doing, according to quantum physics. Whereas in the old model, it was passive. You just have to sit in the theater, maybe eat your popcorn, buy a hot dog, and all you thing you have to do is watch. That makes for a lazy mind. So thoughts in quantum physics are definitely material, not products of the willing mind. So the mind cannot, by snapping its finger, produce thoughts. They need to be made the hard way. By changing habits, by repeating stuff, you change the material thing. And in the end, understanding will pop up without any effort. You put that effort in before. So that's how it works. And I think that's how they see responsibility in a country, for instance, like India. They're not as lenient with errors in the judicial system there. Errors are not looked that easy on as there are in the Western world. One expects people to train these things on a daily basis, and then you don't get clumsy enough to drive over somebody by mistake. That's how they're thinking a bit. That's a crude model to show. If you train every day, discipline, you will be strong, your thoughts will be accurate. What you want to do will be done by command. You better control of yourself. And that's responsibility. They do not think that in a situation you will be able to sort of have an inner intention. And then that intention is somehow good or bad, and they try to judge that. That's an intention. An Indian person would say, I can't see that intention. I don't know where it is. What I can see, what the person done. And I would say that's a better way because that's observable. Whereas in the Western world, we have this intention, something transcendental. We need to see that will is connected to things you do. And to strengthen the will, you do things that are hard every day. And you become stronger and you become more in control. So this, you see here, it's another view on determinism as well. And we are coming into areas like human determinism, like judicial determinism. Was I free to make a choice? It's not my fault I was born in an impoverished family where the father was an alcoholic, something like that. That's the Western view. Whereas the Indian view is you always have the choice to change your material thoughts. And root learning is one tool. There are other tools, but root learning is one of the tools. And I imagine it doesn't come to any surprise that root learning is incredibly important in India, incredibly important. You need to know an incredible amount of stuff. So it's not learning by sitting at the theater, taking popcorns and hope it sticks. I even heard this lady saying to me, oh, I don't remember things, but I know what to do now. And I thought it was, oh, she's going to train her memory, her mind somehow. No, she was going to buy some medicine. And that is as ludicrous to buy a medicine to make you speak, I don't know, Arabic or something like that. Special pill, maybe spiced up with curry or something similar. That we're going to make me speak Arabic. Then I don't have to open the grundskolebook in Arabic. I just take the pill. Isn't it ludicrous? A person can say, I'm not responsible even for my own memory. It has nothing to do with me. My memory as it is. Well, you see, if you have this idea from the beginning, this foundational idea that the memory you have is not part of yourself, we have already lost a huge bit of our will. And that's a fourth aspect of quantum mechanics and the Western dogma. Because the Western dogma tricks us into getting irresponsible with our own lives, our own bodies. And it's even gone so far, there's a lot of people in Western society who thinks they have the right to skip their responsibility. Like their own lives does not longer belongs to them, but it's like das man or conformity that asks you to take care of yourself somehow, or responsibility on yourself. The society wants you to do that. And those people think we have right to be lazy. We have the right not to engage ourselves in our own lives. I think an Indian person was that would be absolutely crazy. Try not to be responsible for 5 minutes in Delhi and you'll be dead. You don't survive in India if you don't take full responsibility for your life. Every crossing of a road in Delhi, it's a play with life and death. And you need to be extra careful all the time. You can't do any mind wandering as Frederick Matthias Alexander warned you against, because you'll be dead. That would drive you over. It keeps you on the toes, but you shouldn't be on the toes, eller hur? You should be on your heels. And most definitely, if you walk around in India, you'll see people mostly being more or less aware of what's around them. And engaging in a nice snack in their mouth, having a video conference on the phone, and maybe have some chit chat with the next person, something like that. We can do marvels when we are aware of the surroundings. And that's the fifth aspect of the Western dogma. Because of the origo thinking, the origin thinking, the subject in front of objects in space, we immediately cut out big piece of reality. Because what is objects in space in front of a subject? Well, you have this view all of a sudden. And only Westerners in checkups, when you do experiments with them, tend to block out the backside. Only Westerners. That's a Western trait. And it gets its effect with the posture. You get this posture. Instead of being opening up, we're taking everything in. And what is this also in drawing and painting, Kalle?
Central perspective.
Yeah, it's the central perspective. So it could also be a photograph, and it can also be the television. I have a memory there when I was in Japan. One of those most shocking things were the brutality of the action things, and even children's action things. Now, especially in the 90s, there was some while ago. Of course, today is more blood on the telly, but I was shocked. It was blood squirting all over the way, and it was gory details, and I remember somebody cut somebody's eyes out, and that was on. The children watched that. They were like 13 and 14 years old. And I said, how can you let them watch this garbage? That's going to make them destroyed. And I remember the mother, she was just stunningly looking at me. What? It's just a screen? It's not reality. And I realized directly she has a point. But to Westerners, the TV, the cinema is very real. She perceived the TV to be a box with some light behind somehow. That's not reality. And she has a point. Because think of real blood or a real fight. That will incorporate not you being in a subject with an object in space in front of the subject. That would be real. That would be an intention there. You have an action. Whereas sitting in front of the TV, there's no action at all. And to have a reality in quantum physics, there need to be action, intention, and this is number 6. Intention comes into the game, very much so. Why is that? Yes, it's because your intention is what's make the superposition collapse. So action is part of the whole thing, and therefore a TV screen is not real because there's no action going on. You are sitting still with maybe a popcorn ball in your hand or a soft drink or doing something else. You're not active. Whereas in a real fight, you be active, either running away, defending yourself, being stunned or whatever. You are in the thing, practically doing something. And this is the 7th use from quantum physics. Nothing gets real if you don't do it. And that's something that comes from the Western dogma, and that is the idea. Things can be real. Knowledge, as I mentioned before, that could be real without you practicing it, without you repeating it. First one time, a second time after 24 hours, the third time after 3 to 4 days. But it's also all the other things here. What we say, like doing politics, we say often having a voice. Writing something today on the internet is having a voice. Writing letters to Riksdagsmen or senators or members of parliament. Actually, politics has very little to do with only talking or having a point of view. And I would like to quote Clint Eastwood here. Views are like assholes, everybody have one. And what he means by that, views are pretty useless unless there is an action behind it. And the action is what makes politics, for instance. We don't understand that. Therefore, we don't have transparency to see how much power do we have. Do we have any say in the politics? Well, if you just looked at the explicit, the wordings, what people say, you can say in Sweden we are at liberty to say whatever we want. But is it like that in reality if you take action into the figuration? And if we would talk to Chinese, I had a person from Taiwan a couple of months here. He was stunned. He didn't think it was a democracy in Sweden. Because in Taiwan they think about action. What sort of action is there? Not what people are saying. Because you need to have an action as well. Of course you need to have an opinion. Everybody has one, as Clint Eastwood said. But you have to have action. And action only comes when you have a collective cooperation. And he didn't see that much going about in Sweden. And he has a point. Action is what makes reality. I can also mention Paul Feyerabend, one of my favorites. He liked to show that science, even today, nothing's changed according to Feyerabend. Still to this day, science is doing things. It's adjusting the instrument in CERN, it's doing something to a telescope, it's doing something with figures. But what happened today is the PR people are usually the theorists who explains the idea behind the Higgs boson, for instance. Feyerabend was especially interested in the Higgs boson because that one, the credit for it came to the theorists. But he saw that there were thousands of people working in CERN and all of them did something manually. We're talking quantum physics. You need to do things. You need to adjust things, you need to clean the CERN reactor, you need to do loads of things. You calibrate the instruments. I don't even know about the complexity. The complexity of CERN is like a small planet, Jeff planet or something like that. But you do stuff. We as receivers with the Western dogma, we get influenced exponentially. We're already passive and then we read a newspaper about CERN and we have some verbal explanation of what's happening in CERN. But we don't have the practicality. And then we start thinking the whole world is transcendental and therefore everything they do at CERN is transcendental as well. Well, when it comes to the actual particle, I would agree almost, because that's very, very close to be completely transcendental. I'd say it was actually created at CERN. It didn't exist before, but it was created in CERN. But they did stuff there. It's action. Everything is action. Making a space shuttle is action. Producing a new medicine is action. You do things still to this day that need to be done. But we get this perception they don't do anything else from inside their heads in the transcendental subject somehow. Well, that's losing the grip of reality. There is a reality, but that reality consists of action and words. They go hand in hand. We try to cut out one piece of the world. And this is what we usually call dualism. And I bet you haven't heard dualism explained this way before. But what we do, we cut it in half. And we say, we don't need this part. We concentrate on that part. That's the good stuff. Marginalize the other one. Priority on this one. This is the light side. That's the dark side. push it away. Well, it's not a good idea. If you want to be a reality, you have to do both things. And if you do both things, you got the benefit from the both sides. And not only that, you have synergy as well. And that's a word I would like to use more often. Synergy. Let's see here if this is clear enough. Synergy. In English it ends with a Y, in Swedish it ends with a I. Synergy is the effect when you take both parts. You take action and you take the word. You take the opinion and you take the strength. You take memory and you take the memory training. You take both, and then you will have a synergistic effect. You're doubling everything you do, and even more so. And that you will notice. There is a doubling effect in quantum physics, and you get wholer. And you will actually feel that every part of you gets stronger, because there's no division in quantum physics. Your body and your mind is of the same substance. As I mentioned before, thoughts are material. And the more you start to understand that, that's a process. Well, I can say that thoughts are material, but it's a process to understand that. That takes training, because training is thinking, and thinking is doing stuff. As long as we have material stuff, we do stuff. It's all about doing. This is very similar to what we were talking in before with Tony Chimero and Gibson. And we had this example of the man who was sleeping and he woke up and he needed to know what time it was. He was looking at the wall, it was a clock. And he was using all the things in his apartment to get to work. But they were all like little action packets. He did action, he did something. And I think in the end he ended up in the hall, and he observed that he smashed a banana with his laptop or something like that. You do stuff. The things around you are action laden. A clock is not something that tells the time. It's something that's connected to what you do. You go to work. You go home from work. You go to have lunch. It's connected to the action. The portfolio is not a portfolio to look at only. You do something with it. You carry stuff with it. You have it under your arm. It's also a thing to look at, but it can be both. Whereas in Western culture, we have a tendency to look at a thing like with a Vogelauge, like this. This is an object. Vorhanden, as Heidegger say. This is a vorhanden object. Disaster. This is something for me. In my life, I do something with it. All the objects have an instrumental character. They're not objects per se. They're not dead. And when we take this deadness that Plato felt, he said, we want deadness. His ideal objects in the ideal world were dead. He said himself, more or less. They were static, unchangeable. And what is that if not dead? How can you say that there is an idealistic chair in the worlds of ideas? Idealistic chair. He's suggesting chairs would have existed without humans. We are using chairs. The only reason there is chairs, there are chairs, is because we sit on them. Everything we have around us is because we use them. Heidegger was absolutely right. They are for us. They're not to be looked at, never. So an object is something you do something with. Always, without exception. So you hear now, this is the eighth thing. here you can really hear how far away the Western dogma is from reality. It's so far as you can come. And actually, this is the only escape from reality. It's only done in the Western world, because we constructed this. And it's not really an escape, because you're still there, you're still responsible for your action. It's just somehow you decided not to be in control anymore. And I would call that the trauma of antiquity. Something happened to them. Like a big molestation by a Greek god. Maybe it was Apollo who went down to earth and he shook every other Greek and said, "You are useless," and slapped him. "You don't have control over your own life." Something like that. I don't know. But they were traumatized. It's a trauma to this. And I'm joking here. Of course, the trauma was nothing like violent. Something happened, I don't know. And it was probably not caused by an earthquake or something tangible like that. But something happened with them. I don't know what happened. But escaping from the world, that's extremely Western. It doesn't happen elsewhere. And I named the primitive cultures, as we say, primitive, living in the Amazonas or living in Madagascar. They know everything about reality. Each thing you point at, they know what that is. They can put it in the context. They have its name, it have its use. You can use those rocks for that. You can use that plant to put in your, I don't know, under your elbow to cure or heal or something. I don't know. And that one you can use for tea, and that one you can put to your dog so you will eat it and have a better stomach, and all that and all and all that. Everything is connected. They are observant. They are in the world. Whereas we Westerns, we created this transcendentalism, I'd call it. And this is how so accurately is described by Richard E. Linden. When we used to have the self in the body, in reality, here, and still in the Odyssey, this was seat of consciousness, of subjectivity. And then it moved up to the head. But it didn't stay in the body anymore. It wasn't in the head as body head. It was transcendental all of a sudden. And all of a sudden, this transcendental self that he calls reflective self, it started to have objects. And one of the objects was the body. And all of a sudden, everything slowed down. And we can measure that process. It takes 1.2 seconds now for proprioception to reach the consciousness we created, the reflective consciousness. And that is actually after the action's been taken. Because we don't put any influence on the thoughts. We don't change them. You can't change them in an instance, but you can change them over time. And all the people of the East do that on a regular basis. We need to start doing that as well, because it's also necessary in an oddly way to understand the Western dogma. It's part and parcel. The passivity is part of the not understanding that you are in a dogma. They help each other. But remember the passivity. You need to get out of the theater chair. And how do you do that? Well, you start first with taking some sort of control over your mental faculties. That's very important. And I'll get back to that next term. The ninth thing I would like to mention with the Western dogma, it's an energy sucker. We talked earlier about these T2 muscles. They suck up a lot of energy. It's typical Western culture have T2 muscles. T2 muscles come from the reflective consciousness. They are all interconnected. There are actually other types of neurons that take care of the reflective consciousness, and they are called M2. And the idea I move my hands as if they were not part of my own body, that's the reflective consciousness. So you see, it has significant effect also on the body. It will hurt you in the end. It's actually the Western dogma that leads to misuse in the end. As long as you understand Western dogma not only to be an hypothesis. It could be explained as an hypothesis, but it's also a way of life. It's a way of doing things. It's a way of thinking of your whole bodily system and mind together as being passive. It's so many different things. Things that you originally, from the start, won't even perceive to be of the same nature or having anything to do with each other. Because I really broadened the spectra today. I've been speaking about will, I've been talking about reflective consciousness, but that's how the dogma becomes somehow. And it becomes hard sometimes, but it's no wonder. It's 2,500 years of tradition. There's a lot of uprooting to do. And the comforting thing is when it gets easier, when you get this synergy effect, it gets easier and easier. Actually, it's its toughest in the beginning. But you will receive a lot of energy. I think it was Schrödinger who wrote that he never felt energy as he felt after quantum physics. Han kallas die Kraftzeug, an energy resource. It gives energy. The insight into quantum physics gave them energy and strength and stamina. And especially Schrödinger lived to be a very healthy person, both mentally and bodily, because he had a significant effect in his life. And I think it's the most sane thing you can do, because I think in 2-3 lectures I will point out the things that the Western dogma does. It sucks out energy, it makes things obscure, it makes it impossible to plan. It makes everything so much complicated because it's an extra complication invented at some stage. So you need to do this extra complication and the regular stuff. And that means by doing the regular stuff you have lost a lot of energy just doing the planning, which is so cumbersome with this idea of object in space in front of a subject. Makes it so difficult. So my idea is to simplify stuff quite a lot. And you don't have to have these different levels as well. And maybe I think the most comforting thing for me is to understand that thoughts are really material. Because all of a sudden it makes sense. I can observe my thoughts. It didn't make any sense before. What was I observing? Actually, I had a stage in my life that I was thinking actually that thoughts were unreal. Can you imagine? And that was a horrible time actually, I remember now. I realize now that thinking really was horrible, like thinking thoughts are unreal. It's a little bit like Daniel Dennett Light, the philosopher who thinks not only his thoughts are unreal, not material, but he also thinks that himself doesn't exist. Poor devil. But I wonder sometimes, does he really literally means it? Or is it just something he says? I think actually, in his case, it's something he just says. He doesn't really realize what he's saying. Otherwise, he would never say it. Because he would go nuts thinking such a thing. Okay, with this little kick at Daniel Dennett, maybe he's going to become our new scapegoat after Descartes. No, I don't think so. I'll end up, I say thank you very much, and until next time we'll be recording on the way to somewhere. Okay, bye-bye, and thank you.
Thank you.